There's a great debate among rabbinic scholars, and certainly in the Torah itself, about whether children are supposed to be punished for the mistakes and sins of their parents, or whether children are not supposed to be punished for the sins and the mistakes of their parents. I have to admit that to us sitting here today, it seems a little bit like an unfair question, doesn't it? Why would anyone be held responsible for something that they didn't do? However, as Rabbi Ovadia Sforno points out, the famous Italian Torah commentator, for most of human history, especially in medieval Europe when he was living, this was not obvious. If a person rebelled against the king, guess who was punished? What, do you think it was just that person? No, the entire family of that person was punished too. And I would also say that before we as moderns are quick to jump and to judge people for visiting sins of parents on children, as Jews we have to take a hard look at ourselves and our own approach to modern Germany. As Jews, this week I have noticed we've been really concerned about ice cream. No one's been talking about the fact that 150 people died in Germany this past week. A part of me feels terrible. Loss of human life is horrific. And yet I have to admit, as someone who was raised in the lessons and taught about the Shoah, that a part of me looks at rural Germany, not a part that I'm proud of, and says, good, let children suffer for the sins of their parents. Again, I'm not proud of that emotion, but I'm also not too afraid to admit that it's also there. It certainly doesn't help that the Torah provides absolutely no clear guidance on the subject, at least not at first. On the High Holy Days, we all sing a familiar tune. It's a very important climactic moment in the service. We say, Adonai, Adonai el Rachum v'chanun. God is a compassionate God, v'chata v'nakeh, and God forgives iniquity. But isn't it convenient how the writers of that melody left off the second part of the verse? We're told that God does not forgive iniquity up until the fourth generation for some sins. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren can be punished for the sins of their parents and grandparents. Only then we come to our Haftarah this morning and we see a message about personal accountability and responsibility. And I'm reminded on this first Shabbat following Tisha B'Av that we replace the hard rebuke of Jeremiah and Exodus with 7 straight weeks of consolation. Speaking to the first generation of Jews in exile, the children of exiles, as I said this morning, Isaiah says, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, Kinisa Avona. Kids, as one famous singer from Minnesota named Robert Zimmerman famously said, the times they are a-changing. The punishment that was doled out to your parents is not to be doled out to you. And sure enough, barely 40 years after the Jews were sent into exile, Cyrus the Great comes and tells the Jews in Babylonia, guess what? You can go home. You can go back to Eretz Yisrael. The punishment of your parents is not yours. It's an echo of the theology we read in Deuteronomy. Lo yumtu avot al banim, banim lo yumtu al avot. Children are not to be put to death for the sins of their parents, nor parents to be put to death for the sins of their children. Each and every one is responsible for the way they act themselves. That's why Ovadia Sforno concludes that while human kings are without compassion, the Melech Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our God, is the God of pity and compassion. Why? Because he only holds each of us responsible for our own mistakes and no one else. Why am I talking this Shabbat about the relationship between parents and children? You know, I have to admit that despite what I said a little earlier about more important life concerns, It's largely because social media and rabbi message boards have been inundated with a discussion about a new television program called My Unorthodox Life on Netflix. Now, those of you who know me know that I already have a bias against watching Jewish television, mostly because while Jews navigating their struggles with Judaism is a fascination for you, it's an occupation for me. I don't know a single lawyer who likes watching what they like to call plea bargaining and order, because in most cases never see the inside of a courtroom. Doctors hate ER. They come home to get away from the emergency room. I suspect that if there were a show about accountants, they would hate that too. And so when you say, Rabbi, did you see the television program about the Jewish person struggling with their Judaism and the way it connects to their life? I usually say, yes, I did. It happened in my office last Thursday. And it happened the last Thursday before that. However, in this particular case, my mixed feelings about My Unorthodox Life, which has been a top 10 Netflix-watched program by the country and the world this week, is something else entirely. And it really has to do with the way that the main character, Julia Hart, who I'm told actually lived in Toco Hills at one point, how she pushes her life trauma onto her children. It's the opposite of the Nachamu theology. It's passing your own tsuris onto your own kids. I don't want to say as a parent that I am not without sympathy. Those of us who have been parents know that we're all guilty of this to some extent. We all have life experiences that shape us. They help us mold our parenting styles. Dennis Prager famously said, the only family without dysfunction is the one that I haven't met yet. But when you watch a show like My Unorthodox Life, which is the story of a woman who leaves the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community, she goes from Muncie to miniskirts, a total 180, you soon realize how much the show is not about her unorthodox life. It's about how her children are left to pick up the pieces and navigate their lives based in the mixed messages and inconsistencies that she has created because of her life choices. That's not fair to her kids. That's the heart of the matter. And I think that's honestly what bothers rabbis so much and what bothers me so much about the show. It's not that she wants to live an unorthodox life. I live an unorthodox life. It's very exciting. I said, my unorthodox life. It's that time and time again she revisits her own sins on her children. And rather than living their own lives and make their own choices and mistakes and have their own experiences, she almost nearly forces some of them to choose her path in rather inappropriate ways. And if you haven't watched the show, I'm really not going to elaborate on that. A colleague once shared with me a story of a middle-aged parent who was so angry at God following the death of her parents that she pulled her child out of religious school, refused to let her daughter have a bat mitzvah, and left the synagogue. I remember that colleague expressing to me the frustration that no matter what was discussed in that office between that rabbi and that congregant about not imposing her own theological issues on her child, that none of that mattered to that particular person. And in the end, guess who suffered the most? It was the child. And not only did this person deprive that child of an important simcha, but she deprived herself of the very simcha she needed to counterbalance the sadness of her loss. Of course, it's no crime to leave a Jewish community, to look for something else in life. However, this Shabbat I would ask to the writers of that show, and certainly to Julia Hart, the protagonist, to what extent are you imposing your own issues on your own children? How is that fair? And if you're not careful, as Exodus warns us, might there be ramifications not only for your children, but to the fourth generation forward for what you've done. On a lighter note, Groucho Marx once said that he found television to be quite educating. Why? Because every time someone would turn on the television set, he would go into the other room and read a book. At times, watching Jewish television for me feels that way. I don't watch Stissel, even though my wife raves about it. I don't watch every new Holocaust documentary, even though some of them are quite excellent. And I will tell you that after watching just 2 episodes of My Unorthodox Life over my wife's shoulder in bed, I will not waste another single moment watching it again. Instead of binge watching the next 7 hours, here's what I'm going to do with my life, and maybe you'll consider doing the same. I'm going to reflect on how I can be personally accountable for my own mistakes. I'm then going to go donate to the German Red Cross to help them in their time of need. And as a parent, I'm going to go play with my kids and, God willing, teach them lessons about how they can grow into strong, resilient, compassionate human beings, just as I believe that our compassionate God, as Sephorno said, wants and expects from all of us. Shabbat Shalom. At this time, I believe we will continue with the prayer for our country and the prayer for the state of Israel. Leaders and readers today. You guys want double duty. Alan, Cindy, come on up. Page 177.